Well, prices are rising across the world and inflation has soared in many countries. We hear that often said by the Prime Minister, particularly this week. But what is most to blame for the recent inflation? Some say the conflict in Ukraine, supply chain bottlenecks and greedy corporations included on that list. But many say the cause of the latest inflation surge is the response to COVID and the lockdowns, which forced government to flood economies with trillions of dollars. Joining me live is Washington correspondent for The Australian, Adam Creighton. Adam, great to see you. Obviously, the situation in the US
Likewise,
is a bit worse than in Australia, but break it down for us. How did we get to this point?
Look, that's right. The inflation rate in the US is currently 8.5%, so substantially worse than Australia's 5.1%. But I think the underlying cause of this inflation in both countries and also in Europe and the UK is fundamentally the same, and that is a very rapid growth in the money supply. And the reason that that has happened is because governments around the world have spent trillions of dollars to try to prop up their economies because of the lockdowns that they imposed. And now we're basically paying for that. I mean, to take the case of the US, the money supply there, obviously it's a huge economy. It crept up fairly slowly over the 5 years to 2020 from about $12 trillion to $15 trillion. But then in the space of 2 years, it jumped to $22 trillion. So it increased 50% in just 2 years. Now, the population did not increase 50%. Certainly the amount of goods and services did not increase 50%. So you have all this money chasing roughly the same amount of goods. And so that's why you're seeing this very elevated level of inflation. And it's broadly the same phenomenon in Australia. But the good news for Australia is that the money supply back home has only increased about 20% or about 25%. So I don't think Australia is going to see the same level of inflation as the US, but it's still going to be painful, and it's going to be politically painful for the government, or indeed if the Labor Party, if it wins in May.
Sure, and some economists are saying there might be a bit of a lag effect here in Australia because we had another lockdown whilst, the US economy was much more open. Do you prescribe to that theory that we might be heading towards US level inflation?
Look, well, there's certainly a lag. I mean, between 12 to 24 months. I mean, the first round of huge spending in the US and in Australia was over 2 years ago, and it's basically taken that long for this money to start to seep into prices. So there is certainly a lag, and we could be living with this inflation for another 2 years, I would say, elevated levels of inflation. And just while we're on the topic, I think the idea of increasing the interest rate by 0.25 percentage points here or 0.5 percentage points there is not going to make a scrap of difference to the rate of inflation. I mean, if central banks are serious about getting inflation under control, they're seriously going to have to jack up those rates hugely. But we both know they can't do that because we are living in the most indebted society in the history of the world, and if they did that, the governments couldn't afford interest payments, businesses and households couldn't afford interest payments. So they can't do that. So central banks are just hoping, if you like, that this inflation kind of comes down of its own accord.
Yeah, there's no monetary levers left when your interest rate is at 0.1% as it is here in Australia. Now, they're talking about maybe increasing the rate next week, likely in June. We can all see where inflation is at. We see it every day at the supermarket. Some economists are talking about a recession down the track. What steps do central banks and governments need to put in place in order to avoid that? Well,
look, it's a very hard question. That's the $1 trillion question, if you like. If governments knew how to do that, they'd be very successful. But no, that's fine. Look, I mean, I think they need to get their finances under control. Fundamentally, this problem is a creation of governments, not of central banks, of their massive deficits, of their money creation to fund wasteful spending. I mean, it works in the short term, but the costs build up over time, and ultimately you're going to have to pay for it. And that's what's happening now. It's great that unemployment is really low in the US and really low in Australia, but that tends to mean that there's only one direction for it from here, and that is up. Who knows? Markets over here, investors are thinking that there could be a recession in 2023, 24, but it's hard to see that far in the future when we've got the war in Ukraine. Something can change dramatically, and the outlook is completely changed.
Yeah, so in the United States, are you seeing the problems over there that we've got here where Certainly, it's almost at full employment, it would seem. The official figures say that, and business is certainly feeling it, where they just can't get the workers. Is that what's happening there too?
Yeah, look, certainly that's right. Wages over here, I think, are up 5.6% over the year, which is a lot, and probably the biggest increase in wages, I would say, in many decades. But, prices have increased 8.5%, so real wages are still falling. But yes, the labour market has shrunk in the US. The unemployment rate's 3.5 or 3.6. It's very, very low. But the size of the labour market, the total pool of people who are employed, is still smaller than it was in 2019. And that's because millions of Americans left the labour force during the pandemic and they haven't come back. So that has made it harder for some businesses to hire people, and you're seeing that reflected in the faster wage growth. I think there's a similar phenomenon happening in Australia where you've got the pickup in wages, but unfortunately for wage earners, you've got prices rising even faster.